Awesome. Welcome back to the Hornthrowers podcast. We are joined by Sarah from the trad metal band Smoulder. Very excited to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having us.
No worries. Yeah, so the first question's like a very sort of general one just to get the ball rolling. But what was your introduction into kind of like the world of heavy metal more generally?
Yeah, so I guess like the very first metal band that I ever listened to was Iron Maiden. I was in grade 8, and I think I was at the time reading Brave New World because it's, a book that is one of the things you read in grade 8. And one of my friends, because I told him how much I love the book, he was like, "Oh yeah, this band that I really like just put out an album based on that book." And he brought it over to my house, and that was the first time I had ever heard anything like that. And I was like, all right, like I'm now obsessed. And so yeah, it was the year, I think it was 2000 or 2001. So here we are 23 years later.
Oh, so it was like at release of the Brave New
Yeah.
World album and stuff. But
Yeah, exactly. It was like month of release, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly.
Oh, that's cool because that's like a really, really cool time to sort of get back onto that kind of back on track with Iron Maiden. Bruce had just rejoined the band and it was like a really exciting time. So
Yeah, I mean, I had never really heard anything like that. Like growing up, my family wasn't like into much heavy music at all. I had been introduced by my dad to bands like Tears for Fears and Pink Floyd and Dire Straits and things like that. But I had never heard anything with like dueling twin guitars and like wailing vocals and those types of things. So, and yeah, it really opened my eyes to the fact that like music could be a lot, I guess, more interesting and like engaging and thematically rich than what I had previously experienced. So yeah, I still love that album to this day.
no, it's a absolute like solid album and like a good return to form after like a
couple of clunkers.
Yeah, I was trying to be polite there, but yeah, it wasn't Iron Maiden at its best, put it that way. Yeah, no, but it's like that's a really cool intro. I think like my cousin getting me into Iron Maiden was kind of like the same thing for me, and weirdly enough, like 'cause I know it's usually people's parents that get them into like those kind of classic bands, but I actually got my dad into Iron Maiden and whatnot, and it was yeah.
Yeah, it's cool. I mean, obviously, like everyone gets into music differently. And I think metal is kind of interesting that way because I think a lot of people are like, "Oh yeah, I was 5," and I'm like, "Nope, that's not the thing." But it's fine. Um, yeah, like I've since shared, music with lots of my family members, and the person who actually really encouraged me to get more into heavy metal was my sister, who doesn't like heavy metal at all. She actually loves pop music, but she was just stoked and a couple years older and wanted to encourage me to get into something. So I just remember several birthdays in a row, I was trying to buy every single Iron Maiden CD in high school. And it was because I really wanted that Eddie that was on the spines of all of those CD reissues. And she ended up buying me a whole bunch of them, which I thought was, really cool, especially because, she's into stuff like pop music, like Ricky Martin and the Spice Girls and like things like that. So yeah, it kind of, it helped me kind of, I think a long time ago, contextualize like how people get into music and, how, because this is one part of the metal scene that I just hate. I absolutely loathe the gatekeeping.
Oh
And
yeah,
like part of it that I'm just like, nah, I don't want to participate. Not a 15-year-old boy. I don't need to like punish people for liking things that I don't like. It's not who I am. So I think very early on that lesson got cemented down really, really hard.
no, like I'd speaking as a former 15-year-old boy and gatekeeper who looks back in shame at ever behaving that way. Like, yeah. And kind of one thing with the radio show, the podcast, everything we're doing is trying to create a more welcoming environment to people and just generally be excited about more people getting into the subculture and whatnot.
Yeah. And I mean, of course, like I like that metal has grown to be more inclusive in a lot of ways. And I think a lot of people are trying to do just that. Because, of course, when I was younger, I also did some of that gatekeeping. And a lot of it was like reinforcing, because when I was in high school, I remember very clearly, first getting into like death metal. Some of the boys in my class were like, "Oh, fuck you, poser." And I was just like, "Oh, eat shit, bud." And so it you know, there's been times over the years when I've definitely been that punishing person who is gatekept to someone else. But, you know, I'm now in my like mid to late 30s, and I just, that just sounds so exhausting. I can't imagine keeping that up my entire life. And I know a lot of metal dudes do, and I just can't imagine being that person.
Yeah, I'm
exhausting.
I very quickly had that beaten out of me and kind of like learned a bit of humility along the way, thankfully.
Yeah.
So I'm actually, I have like a list of questions, but like kind of like what you were talking about then, I might just like skip ahead to a question that a friend of mine had for you.
Sure.
She's like a really big fan of everything that you do, and I mean everything to the point of like your academic career as well.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right.
So
We're
she
going
was like,
back.
so she sent me like a link to one of the papers that you wrote about sort of like extreme responses to, like, it was basically about like a kind of female experience in metal.
Yeah,
And
yeah. I wrote my master's thesis on the experience of female musicians in extreme metal. And it was called Extreme Conditions Demand Extreme Responses. Obviously, it was named after the Brutal Truth you know, thing. But yeah, it's funny because that was already more than 10 years ago. Which is, yeah, the last 10 years have gone by quickly.
yeah,
That
well, as you can tell, she was very excited to hear that we had you on the show. So, and she's a philosophy major, so
Cool.
the question is worded quite academically. So it's how does she balance a refusal to adopt patriarchal attitudes and the desire to occupy higher spaces in the hierarchy of the metal scene, i.e., how do you know when to pick your battles and to play the game?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, it's probably going to sound funny, like out of context for a lot of people, but yeah, I mean, obviously there are a lot of interactions that I find myself in that I'm like, oh God, this is this is a lot of work to unpack. But for example, you know, we play a lot of gigs, and a lot of those gigs contain people who say things and do things that I consider pretty misogynistic and unpleasant to just have to deal with. But generally, like, my rule of thumb is if someone's well intentioned, then I'll avoid a battle, because I don't think that, you know, like, people don't always realize that their actions are being perceived by the person who's like at the receiving end of them, that they're, you know, there's some things that they need to unpack in how they treat other people. But the ones that when I pick a battle, it's because someone has come to me in a really aggressive way. And I don't really want to like expand on that, because I don't need to, like, I'm not in the habit of like publicly calling out behavior, because when it happens in the moment, I tend to say to the person who's acting inappropriately, being like, hey, why are you doing this thing? And then if they get angry, I'll be like, I'm perceiving this as you being aggressive and like misogynistic. I don't appreciate it. Like, what is going on, you know? And I find that direct approach, like, I think any adult will tell you it, regardless of them being, you know, a member of the metal scene or just at work or anything, like, direct action is generally the best way to act in general. You know, like, if you're just honest with people and you ask them why they're behaving a certain way, it's a lot easier to kind of confront that stuff head on than it is to, you know, like, internalize and stew and get angry about it.
No, I understand that. Like, you know, obviously speaking as a man, I don't have like a lot of like lived experience of what it's like to be a woman in the metal scene, and I'm only kind of guessing it secondhand from a lot of my friends who are like, you know, talking about that kind of like hostility that sometimes that is felt towards them, and, you know, again, to get back to gatekeeping and whatnot. But so just to clarify, so you think it's like more like the intention that you're feeling off that person is kind of when you choose to pick that battle?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you know, people who are not being unintentionally aggressive, I think, you know, there's no point in like having a fight with a metal fan who's said something but doesn't realize that I'm perceiving it as being shitty. But yeah, of course, like, some men do approach us, or approach me in particular, with like a lot of aggression. And when that happens, I tend to just confront it directly and be like, dude, what's the problem? You know, but it's a pretty broad question, so it's hard to answer, you know, with a lot of specificity, if that makes sense.
No, it absolutely does, and I think it's a lived experience that Ailey, who was the friend of mine that asked the question, she's fronted metal bands in the past and kind of occupied the same space as a woman, and I kind of think, yeah, I think that was where she was coming from, and maybe looking for some advice there.
Well, I mean, yeah, you do have to like learn how to protect yourself for sure. I think the thing is like the bigger the shows that we play are, the more exhausting and frequent like shitty interactions are. And so one of the best things you can do is just kind of protect yourself and stay out of areas where people will be kind of inundating you with like inappropriate comments. And obviously like I have to perform the same band duties as everyone else in the band.
Mhm.
And that means like selling merch and signing things and talking to people and then being on stage and, as a vocalist being kind of like the center of attention. So I just, I act really, really aggressive on stage. And that helps me kind of like exercise the anger that I sometimes feel about being treated like I'm lesser than everyone else.
I suppose like being able to like wield a sword on stage as well is kind of helps channel that.
And it helps if you actually love the music that you're playing,
Of course.
Like I'm very proud of what we do. So I feel very like liberated getting on stage and being super aggressive and loud and in people's faces. And I think that it helps, challenge a lot of those perceptions that women don't belong in the metal scene.
Yeah. No, like that's a really fleshed out answer. Thank you. So like just as a kind of like getting back onto the kind of like more general setting the groundwork for the interview stuff that I kind of skipped over to begin with.
It's fine.
What was the kind of origin story of Smoulder? Like obviously you had your academic career and whatnot. And then I know that you do a lot with like Banger TV, etc. Like, how did Smoulder come about and begin?
Yeah. So yeah, I've been writing about heavy metal since I was like 15, actually. And way back in high school, I was like the editor-in-chief of the school newspaper, and I went to a really big school. There was 1,000 kids in my graduating class. So it was actually like a pretty serious thing that I wanted to do. And then I started actually writing for a music magazine also when I was 15. And back then it was just, I loved music and wanted to participate in it. And for years, I really wanted to be in a band. I started playing the drums. I must have been like 22, 23. And eventually I was in a punk band for a while, but it just kind of wasn't what I was, passionate about. And eventually I met Vincent, who is the guitarist of Smoulder. And he at the time was a bassist and he wanted to learn how to play guitar. And I was trying to get better at drums. So we were both really into like the same kind of doom metal. And it was a kind of doom metal that was not in fashion at all. Like we came from a city where everyone played sludge and we thought sludge was lame. We did not want to play sludge. We wanted to play doom. Like we both loved, Reverend Bazaar and Lamp of Thoth and Gates of Slumber. And like we wanted to play doom that felt epic and was like more barbarian-esque. So, I mean, we jammed for like 5 years before we even released a demo. And at the time I was on drums, Vincent was on guitar and vocals. And so over the years, the band kind of developed as my academic career was coming to an end. And after my thesis got published, it just was really hard. Like I ended up getting doxxed, for like a lot of men who were just like really angry about the thesis. And at the same time, like Gamergate was happening. And so there was a lot of like aggression, and there were certain days when I'd wake up and like my inbox would be full of like rape and murder threats. And I was just at this point where I was like, gross, like, I don't want to deal with this shit. Like I have been a lifelong metal fan and like, I love heavy metal, and I had written a lot about heavy metal in other contexts, but a lot of people really took it personally, that I was writing about gender and heavy metal. So I just kind of realized that like, it wasn't my job to like fix that stuff. And I just wanted to do the things that I cared about, which was, making my own art and being interested in my own art. So yeah, I kind of shifted away from the academia part, because I think any academic in heavy metal will probably tell you the same thing, which is like, if you look too close, you start not liking it very much.
Yeah, we've got
got
a guy that's written a philosophical text about metal that's coming on the show soon. it's got published on Zero Books or something, and it's about like socialism in metal and stuff like that. So I can imagine that's quite controversial. But like, wow,
Yeah.
I can't believe that you had to experience that though. That's again,
mean,
like as a dude, like that whenever I speak to like my female friends, I'm just kind of like have my mind blown about this like whole different lived experience that they've had, things that I've never even had to consider. That's just so fucked up.
Yeah, I mean, like looking back on it now, I don't feel angry about it anymore. It actually just kind of reinforced how important it was to be in a band and to basically normalize, you know?
Yeah.
And that's kind of the thing about like being about being an academic, is that academia tends to like point out problems and like social infrastructure issues and talk about like how, you know, the social infrastructure of a scene might have gone that way. But the more that I wrote about heavy metal and the more that I kind of got exhausted on like gender as a topic, the more that I realized that like we didn't need to be talking much more about the problems of gender. We needed to be normalizing the experience of like women and people of color and like trans people and like LGBTQ folks in heavy metal, because that's what makes our participation easier for everyone, is like lots of bands featuring diverse people that are of high quality. And I think like it's been really interesting in the last 15 years to see the shift, because there are tons more diverse people who are now fronting and part of heavy metal bands. And I think like that's, you know, that the change, it's small, but it's happening more frequently now. And I think that like that to me is a huge win. Like it makes the metal scene a healthier, better, and not only that, way more interesting sonically placed to exist.
Yeah, we had Melissa Moore from the band Sonia on recently.
Yeah.
And yeah, that like she put out like one of the best trad albums of last year. It was great.
Yeah.
But it was just kind of interesting speaking to her and that kind of the empowerment she felt through metal, and you talking about being more celebratory of it rather than sort of like pointing out the criticisms and stuff. And like, yeah, that kind of like more direct thing is quite interesting, of like, you know, actually just going out, doing it and fronting bands as opposed to complaining about the lack of it. And
yeah, well, that's the thing, right? It's like, I think that there's a lot of validity to pointing out the issues that heavy metal has, and not just heavy metal. Like, obviously, I don't think that heavy metal is necessarily worse than like any other culture or community or scene. Like every single scene has problems, every single culture has problems. But yeah, like I do think that there's more power and like more joy to be found in like normalization and celebration. And so a big part of doing Smoulder has just been like, no, I'm just gonna do this, and if people don't like it, then they can kiss my ass. You know? And like I feel very good about that, because you know, and I've seen a little bit of the negative stuff, and obviously I don't go seeking it out, but I've definitely seen it, and I've seen, you know, some comments that people make about me that are like pretty gross, but that does not cancel out, like we've gotten so much attention, so much allocates, so much celebration, and I'm like, what am I gonna let like 5 misogynistic trolls like ruin my life's work? Like, fuck no. Like they're losers. Like they're mad because I'm succeeding in spite of their criticism. So like I think there's a lot of like joy to be had in like turning around and telling somebody who, you know, is telling you you can't succeed, just being like, well, I just did, so what are you gonna do about it?
Absolutely. And those are the kind of people that you just want to make mad. Like,
yeah, exactly. Just be like, oh, bud, I'm sorry you can't handle it. My band's gonna go headline another festival, so see you later.
No, absolutely. And I think that's like the best attitude to have. Sorry, there was a digression. So we covered like that Smoulder happened when you sort of like met the now guitarist of the band and wanted to make a more epic kind of doom.
Yeah.
I had never even kind of like heard of the subgenre of like epic doom until I started watching your content on Banger TV, and then you introduced me to like bands like Atlantean Codex and things like that, who have since become one of my favorite bands.
Cool.
What would be your like little kind of crash course in epic doom for somebody who's wanting to explore that genre?
I mean, like generally like the very first band that I always say to people is just like listen to the first like 6 Sabbath albums, and then you can switch over to Candlemass. Obviously, Epicus Doomicus Metallicus is like absolute crushing masterpiece. And then after that, head over to Solitude Aeturnus. And then from there you can go into 100 bands. But like that's kind of the thing. It's like Smoulder has, I think, evolved beyond an epic doom band, like I think we're more epic metal, and I think epic metal, like within the umbrella of epic metal, I see that being like US power metal, speed metal, and epic doom. So it's like there's tons of bands that people could listen to, but yeah, like for a crash course in anything like Smoulder related, I'd just be like, people should listen to Blind Guardian, Halloween, Scanner, Chastain, Omen, Messiah Force. Like there's so many amazing bands that I think, like, I mean, some of those bands have been given the credit that I think that they're due, but most of them have not. And the ones that haven't tend to be the ones that inspire us the most, because both Vincent and I are like fanatical underground music fans, like we love finding the bands that did something totally different. And maybe when they came out, they just weren't doing something commercially acceptable enough to like gain popularity. But, all that goes into like the melting pot that is like the recent Smoulder sound.
I think there's just like that level of excitement of discovering this like, long forgotten kind of like relic from like the 80s or something like that, and then being like, why didn't these make it? And then trying to like turn other people onto it. Like I was very much that person like when I was younger. But that kind of like leads on to like a kind of thing, because like you were saying like how your sounds evolved, like very much like the first Smoulder album, I can hear more of the doom influence on that. But like newer songs like Talisman and the Blade that just got released have like a much more speed metal sound to it.
Yeah.
Do you think that's representative of the direction that you're trying to go with the new album?
Well, that's kind of the thing. I think like, because the first album had speed metal too. I mean, Bastard Steel was speed metal. And like there's definitely a bit more speed metal on the new record, but I think there's a bit more everything. Like I also think that we kind of went in a little bit more of a progressive direction, and progressive is such a like loaded term, because I know that people are like, progressive, you mean Dream Theater? And I'm like, no. Like I'm thinking progressive, like the way that Fate's Warning was on their first couple of albums, and so I think that there's speed metal, there's US power metal, there's epic doom. Like there's 2 very, very long, actually 3 very long like epic doom tracks. The very last one being Dragon Slayer's Doom, which is the album closer. And I think that that's our most like Reverend Bazaar song that we've ever written. And like Black God's Kiss from the first album was also very, very doomy. It's just that there's now 7 songs instead of 6. So like we put in, because we have we wanted to like fill out the 45 kind of minute max that happens with like an A and B side of a vinyl, because vinyl tends to like max out per side at like 22 minutes generally. So we were like, all right, we want to make sure that we get like a full A side and a full B side. And so, yeah, it's kind of interesting to like, show Talisman and the Blade first, because some fans were like, where's the doom? And I was like, well, if we had shown Bastard Steel first on the first album, then everyone would have been like, oh, it's a speed metal band. But this kind of ties into the fact that I don't think that a lot of metal history, music nerds, I don't think enough people are acknowledging like the connections between like traditional heavy metal, speed metal, epic metal, and power metal, because like all of those genres are so closely intertwined, but they've kind of like been split off into separate camps, even though there's a lot of overlap between all of them.
Absolutely. And I think we develop like an obsession with like kind of micro genres in metal. And it is like the further back you go, you'll get like bands like Sabbath, for example. Like, yes, obviously massively pioneered like doom, but all of the sort of like new wave British heavy metal bands took a lot from that as well. And you have like tracks like Symptom of the Universe, which is almost like proto thrash metal, and you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really easy for bands and musicians to kind of be like, oh, well, we're a thrash band, so like if this riff is too death metal, or it's too this or it's too that it doesn't belong. And I think that, because people like compartmentalizing things, like just, mentally, because it's easy, you do run the risk of like, confusing, angering, whatever, when you mash a lot of things together. But that's part of the thing that I like the most about Smoulder, is that we are bringing in, a couple of different genres. And I don't think at any point we don't sound like Smoulder, like we're not just like recreating something. Like we've created our own sound, and it is an amalgamation of a lot of different things. And I personally think it's fucking awesome.
No, I agree. And I think that like you definitely have a sound. I know when I'm listening to like a Smoulder track and stuff like that, which is like, kind of like what you want to do when you're refining a sound as a band. In that single Talisman and the Blade, I had a bit of a weird reaction to it, in the sense that I didn't like it when I first heard it, but couldn't pin down what I disliked about it. So I ended up listening to it so many times that it's now become my favorite Smoulder track.
Love it.
and I don't know if it was like the vocal mix or what, but I kind of was getting that your vocals were less prominent in the mix, which might have been it. But at the same time, was it a conscious thing to maybe go for a more 70s production on it with the vocals? Like,
I mean, a little bit, because like when we recorded the first album, I got really frustrated, and it's because like a lot of the recording engineers that you go to are just like, you need to use auto tune, you need to use these effects, you need to use this, and you need to use that. And I remember when we recorded the debut, the recording engineer made me record with auto tune on several tracks. And I had told him like a dozen times, I was like, I don't want this. And so we ended up having to go back through all the takes and delete every single thing with autotune. But it just meant that when we went into the studio this time, I was like, okay, I want to be rock solid. I want to like, and because I practiced so much to record this album. And not only that, but like since we've moved to Finland, like my health has gotten a lot better because I am chronically ill. And in Canada, like I could barely afford to pay my medical bills. And in Finland, like I no longer even close to have that problem. So it's been one of those things where like everything was coming together, and we were able to focus a lot more, or I was able to focus a lot more on like having the fitness level to like perform difficult things. And not only that, but like I felt like the vocals were a little too loud on the debut, and were like, the guys in the band are so talented, and I don't want to be the central focus of the band. Like I'm one piece of a 5-piece band, and everyone in the band has so much talent. So I think it was more just like, all right, like we want to sound a little bit more natural. We don't want there to be like too much reverb on the vocals. We want it to be like, strong and powerful. And like, not only that, but we wanted to make sure that when we were playing live, that we were perfectly recreating what you were hearing on the studio albums. So yeah, there was just like a little bit of a focus away from making me the central focus, and like focusing on everybody so that I wasn't the loudest person in the band.
it definitely does have a live feel. Like I think that, yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. And possibly, I think it took me a few lessons, as I said, to adjust to the new kind of like wave that the vocals are mixed. But it's kind of like I've come out the other side of that, and it probably, as I said, it's my favorite track that you've done like so far.
Well, it's interesting to hear, because I often feel like I hate it. Like maybe I don't want to use the word hate, it's too strong a word. But I often, when I hear something for the first time and I don't like it, but I expect to like it, it then becomes the thing I like the most. And I think that that's, to me, kind of indicative of, like songwriting becoming more complex and like going somewhere new. And there being some sort of like hook that you just keep coming back to, and you're like, oh, like it's like challenging an expectation, but in a way that, makes you grow, I suppose, as like a listener.
Yeah, no, that is like absolutely kind of like developing that ear, and kind of, and I think especially as you get older and things like that, you are less receptive to new sounds and new things, as I was maybe when I was like a teenager and stuff like that. So I find like so I'm not just like listening to the same 10 albums for the rest of my life. I host a radio show as well, so I'm like actively trying to like push myself to explore new music, and it's a very important, if difficult, thing to do as you get older.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's tons of research that shows that most people stop listening to new music around the age of 35. So, and that's young.
Oh, see,
that's
I
really
thought
young.
it was like I thought it was like early 20s that would happen. I'm still in my 20s, so I've got a few years.
Oh, you're still a baby. You got some time.
But yeah, so on to continuing on the topic of the new album, I was so like delighted when I was listening to the new track, and I was like, that's Michael Moorcock, because I'm a huge sword and sorcery nerd and read the Elric novels, etc. I haven't really explored all the other Eternal Champion stuff. Like, I'm aware that there's like a multiverse, and it's something to do with like the same soul being reborn into different bodies or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I was like, and the fact that you guys have all the way through had some of the weirdest sound effects and like oscillating things that kind of were reminiscent of like Hawkwind, but you kind of went the whole hog and like literally had Michael Moorcock doing a poetry reading like they did, and it was amazing. How did that come about?
Yeah, I mean, it's like one of those bragging points that I'll have for the rest of my life. Like, yeah, we were able to get Michael Moorcock to not only narrate something for us, but he wrote that for us too, which is super cool. And yeah, like, we're both, Vincent and I, we're married now, but we have a massive sword and sorcery book collection. We've both been collecting. Well, I guess I introduced him to sword and sorcery books. It probably was like 10 years ago when we first started the band. I was just like, I'm into these kind of novels, and like, you might be interested. And then he got really into it, and then it just, developed. And now we probably have like 30 or 40 Michael Moorcock novels. And yeah, when we were writing the album, so that's one of the songs on the album that Vincent wrote entirely by himself. He wrote both the music and the lyrics, which is pretty unusual for Smoulder. But he ended up writing the entire track, and we were trying to figure out, because like our last album, Ileana Garithorm, is also about one of the iterations of the Eternal Champion, the only female iteration, who is Ileana Garithorm. And the beginning of that song, there's that like 45-second long intro, and Colin did that on keyboards. And it was really spacey and like kind of weird. And we were thinking, okay, if we put this on the B side and we make it the opening track, then we want to have something spacey and weird at the beginning. And it would be really cool if we could get some narration. And we, at one point, Vincent was like, well, what if we asked Michael Moorcock? And I was like, I don't think that'll happen, but I'll see what I can do, and luckily enough, I'm actually friends with a guy in the United States who runs his own sword and sorcery publishing house. It's called DMR Books. So Dave Ritzlin, he runs DMR Books, and I had interviewed him for Banger, and I'd also bought a bunch of his books because he publishes like fantasy novel compendiums that feature stories that are written by current heavy metal musicians.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's really cool. He recently published Jason Tarpe's Godblade, which was like the book that came out with the second Eternal Champion album. And
I wasn't aware of that. That's so cool.
Yeah, it's a pretty cool publishing house. He's published stuff by like Howie Bentley from Cauldron Born and Jeff Black from Gatekeeper and like all these other things. And I've talked to him in the past about like writing something for him, but I am way too goddamn busy, and I need to stop offering or asking people to do projects because I don't have the time. But I emailed him and I was like, hey man, this might be a bizarre ask, and if it's not cool, then that's fine. But do you happen to know Michael Moorcock? Because I feel like you might. And he said, I do. And I was like, can you email him and ask him if he would be okay with giving his email address to a band who's really interested in talking to him? And so Dave came back a little while later and was like, yeah, he's open to hearing what you have to say. And I was like, all right, step one, like, we'll see how this goes. But yeah, we ended up emailing him. I had to follow up like 100 times because he was writing the newest Elric book, which actually was just published this year. He's very busy, obviously. He's like one of the greatest living fantasy authors. And when we initially contacted him, Vincent wanted him to read like the publisher's blurb on the cover of the book. And when we said that, we were like, oh yeah, like, would you consider narrating for us? This is what we were hoping you would read. And he responded with, is it okay if I write something for you instead? And I'm like, yeah, Michael Moorcock, it is fine if you write something for us instead. Like, that's not something you have to ask me. But yeah, eventually we ended up scheduling the call. It was like 4:00 in the afternoon, Texas time, and 2:00 in the morning, Helsinki time. We waited up all night in bed. We were like, oh God, I really hope this happens. We're so nervous. We're so excited. Like, we're actually going to talk to Michael Moorcock on the phone. That's so strange. And then eventually he called, and then he read the piece several times. He was really nice, really cool. And that was it. So it just, yeah, like, I'm a huge fan of Blue Oyster Cult. So to have somebody who had like not only written a whole bunch of books that I like love and have read a bunch of times, but also has worked with one of my favorite bands, I was like, all right, that's a brag.
And like, kind of the roster of bands that Michael Moorcock is somewhat affiliated with is insane. And
Yeah.
his mark on fantasy, and it's a very weird one, because I wouldn't say that he's an unknown author, but he definitely doesn't get the credit for the impact on fantasy that he's had.
Yeah.
Because it's you get someone like Andrzej Sapkowski, who, I'll try and diplomatically put it, has been very influenced by Michael Moorcock.
Yeah.
And I was so in the audio at the start of the track, like, he's mentioned like the conjunction of the spheres. Is that something that's actually originally from Michael Moorcock's multiverse that has been then stolen by The Witcher, etc., or is that, I don't know, because obviously, like, it's kind of fairly conclusive that Geralt of Rivia was very heavily influenced by Elric of Melniboné.
I actually haven't read The Witcher, or I'm not super familiar with The Witcher, because The Witcher was also a game and then it became a series. So yeah, I'm not actually familiar enough with The Witcher to like know if that was the direct thing. Like, yeah,
I can specifically like, I'm sorry, I was asking because you're much more familiar with Michael Moorcock's work. Is the concept of the conjunction of the spheres and things like that, is that something that was pre-existing within Michael Moorcock's mythos?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's like, I mean, like, kind of the how would I explain this? I don't think there's a way to like concisely explain it. But yeah, it's like the multiverse, and so the Eternal Champion exists within the multiverse. There's like numerous iterations of the Eternal Champion, and like the only thing that binds them all is like the soul sucking sword, like
Stormbringer.
Yeah, so it's like that's the conception of the multiverse that like exists. I don't know how it overlaps though with The Witcher. I don't actually know how The Witcher operates.
I think it's like, but the concept is basically that all of the magic and the monsters in that world came about by something called the conjunction of the spheres, where all these multiverses lined up and they bled into each other. And given that he's already like taken so much inspiration from Michael Moorcock when he was in the Witcher novels, and I think he's like been pretty open about the fact that, because Geralt's like an albino swordsman kind of thing, that it's it's pretty unambiguous.
Yeah, I mean, I watched a couple episodes, I think, of that show, because if I'm not mistaken, that Netflix picked it up.
They said that they were adapting the original novels that the games are unofficial sequels to, but but then it'd be devolved into, it's a very, both the games are like unofficial sequels, and the actual show that was an adaptation was incredibly unfaithful, to the point where there's whole season-long arcs that just do not exist in the books, and it's just like, oh dear.
I mean, I think that's pretty common amongst like fantasy, like on-screen fantasy versus like book fantasy, which is kind of why I avoided The Witcher, because I feel like, and I know that this is not a popular opinion to have, but like I am very inspired by like Conan the Barbarian, and like I've read all of the Conan books, and it really irritated me that when I finally saw Conan as like a 15-year-old or 20-year-old or however old I was like, this is not faithful to the books. Because and I know that the Schwarzenegger movie is like considered, I think a masterpiece. A lot of people use that word in relation to that film, and obviously the other ones as well. But it always irritated me that it wasn't faithful to the book, which was like, Conan was like a Hyborian who wanted to go on an adventure. Like, he wasn't a kid who got enslaved and wanted revenge for his family's death. So yeah, like, I think films tend to take liberties that maybe nerds do not appreciate, and that's fine.
Massively so. So are your tastes kind of more like the kind of like pulp sword and sorcery as opposed to like the kind of like big epic Tolkien high fantasy stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I do like high fantasy, and I do love Lord of the Rings. I think the Hobbit trilogy, when it came out, was not
Yeah.
good. That's okay, whatever. I like dragons, so that was cool. But yeah, it's generally like more on the trashy side.
Oh, no, like absolutely. I've got like something like 5 Tolkien tattoos, and like yeah, it was a big formation. I think like it to me sounds very much what Conan was for you.
Yeah.
When growing up.
Quite like Conan.
Yeah, I kind of I really tried. Like, I have the complete Conan giant huge leather bound collection of all of Robert E. Howard stories and stuff, and I found it difficult to get into, and I don't know if it's just because of my tastes don't really kind of like align with like that kind of like pulp era of. Although I do quite like Lovecraft, so I don't. Yeah,
but the difference in writing, it's like, I think Lovecraft was such an interesting writer because he used such arcane terminology. So I think a lot of the time when you're reading Lovecraft, it's unsettling because you don't fully comprehend like how rich the language is. If that makes sense. Like, I've read like 1,000 pages of Lovecraft at least. Like, I have 2 massive compendiums. I've gotten through all of one of them, and I have a master's in communication, and I have underlined the words that I had to look up because I wanted to know exactly what they meant, and there was generally like 5 per page.
Yeah,
and I have
non-Euclidean geometry.
Yeah, like words that you're like, oh, and I think that's part of the reason why Lovecraft felt so creepy and like interesting and compelling, whereas Howard didn't write like that. It was very like serial writing, like installment writing, short stories. And short stories, I generally don't like them by almost any other author, but I did really like them with him, and with both Conan and Red Sonja, and Red Sonja being Dark Agnes, and Dark Agnes being like the character that I would say that I like most identify with, who is the sword woman. But yeah, like, I liked that kind of like short form writing because it was like very like, we're off to have an adventure, and I liked that. And it wasn't like a life-changing grand adventure. It was like, we're off to kill the asshole who did a bad thing. Like, I liked that.
I mean, like, 100% agree with you what you were saying about Lovecraft. It's that feeling of him being a person out of time, because he was writing at the beginning of the 20th century, but had been influenced by like his grandfather's collection of like, stuff like Blake and Poe, and even older stuff like that, like 18th century literature. And
I mean, that sense of him being out of time is also very evident in like the fact that he was a shitty old racist.
Oh, 100%.
Especially at a time when like social attitudes were becoming like more progressive and all that other stuff. Like, he's very much like one of those artists that I think we all can acknowledge and like be like, he was racist as shit. It was quite irritating. And he also had a massive impact on the lexicon of like horror writing and like fantasy writing.
Like racist for his time as well. Like,
yes,
that's kind of, whereas like, being a huge fan of Tolkien, it's like having to deal with the fact that he was born in the 19th century and had very colonialist attitudes that were not uncommon. It's kind of easier to rationalize that than it is like Lovecraft outright just yeah.
Yeah, I think, time will, I think, and that's something that I think everyone has to, well, not everyone does, but I think a lot of people do think about those things now. It's like, how does the beliefs of the writer or the artist impact my enjoyment of their art? And I think it's a good thing to think about that, because it means that you're trying to be empathetic.
Unfortunately, that's massively a recurring theme on our podcast, because we have so many like left-leaning black metal bands on.
Yeah.
So it's like kind of like dealing with the fact that like these people who are absolutely formational to our genre are, unfortunately,
Racist murderers.
Nazis. Exactly. Yeah. And yeah, it's that separation of art and artists really hard when like something's had such a deep and profound, like emotional impact on you. Like,
yeah, well, I mean, but I don't think it necessarily, like, I think we could acknowledge that the people who create art are like, they've had their own beliefs historically and all that stuff. And I think the way to like ethically move forward is to acknowledge that and then create something new from that doesn't recreate the same problems that you've acknowledged in the original. Do you know what I mean?
And I 100% agree with you. And I think it's like with your academic career, where it was perceived as you receive such a hostile response to simply being critical of a thing you love. It doesn't make you less of a fan of that thing for just actually taking a critical eye to it and acknowledging the shitty aspects of it, whether it be like racism, homophobia, sexism that is prevalent within a musical genre, a literary genre that you like. It doesn't mean that you love it less. If anything, you love it so much you want it to be a better space,
Yeah, well, that's kind of the thing, right? It's like, I think a lot of metal fans or fans of really anything, they do respond in a very hostile way to that type of criticism. And it is kind of interesting, like, just because if I kind of extrapolate that just from my journalism career, like, I often have people get very upset with me for being mildly critical of bands that I love. And I find that very funny, to be honest. Like, there's, for example, I remember it was probably 5 years ago, I reviewed like a new Electric Wizard album. And I really loved, Electric Wizard back when I was about 20 years old. I traveled to the US to see their first American show after Juice Oborn was finally able to leave the UK again. I've traveled to see them actually multiple times. But I also think that they kind of like ran out of riffs. And I remember one of their fans came up to me and was like, "Oh, you're not a real fan, and like, fuck you, and you're a poser, and yada, 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 yada." And I just remember sitting down with him and I was like, "All right, we're going to talk about this, because like, you're accosting me in a public space. And I find it like very inappropriate. First of all, like, just because someone doesn't like the same band as you does not give you permission to like berate them in a public space.
Absolutely
like,
not.
Grow up." But I remember sitting him down and I was just like, "Look, man, how long have you been listening to the band?" And he was like, "Oh, like 3 years." And I was like, "Cool. Well, I've been listening to them for 15. I've traveled to see them. I love this record. I love this album. I love this. And like, I expect better of them as a band." And then he went from being like, I didn't realize. And I was like, well, I shouldn't have to like preface that. You know what I mean? Like, I shouldn't have to provide that information to you for you to like respect me enough as a human being to not accost me in public.
Yeah. Your opinion should have been valid just on the basis that you,
I'm saying it. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. And that's kind of the thing, right? It's like a lot of metal fans become like hostile and reactionary because they perceive any criticism as an attack. And it's like, dude, if you had like maybe done any therapy or had healthy relationships in your life, then you would probably be able to like separate the fact that like criticism isn't an attack. It's not a personal attack. And I say that to every single person in the world, because most people are really bad at receiving and giving constructive criticism. But like, yeah, constructive criticism is very good if you're in an emotionally healthy space, because it helps you become a better person. There's nothing wrong with that.
No, like 100%. And I'm kind of like, I've had that myself whenever I've like had like a negative opinion of anything, and then it's perceived that you're attacking this thing that other people love and stuff like that. And The alternative to that is just like blindly enjoying anything that is put out by something that you've decided to latch onto, and I don't think that that's actually having like a stimulating relationship with art. Like,
No, it's not. And metal is very bad for that. And it's part of the reason why we have a lot of these like dinosaur bands that are on album 30 when they probably should have hung up the towel 25 years ago, like because there's like very much a sense of like blind allegiance within heavy metal, for better or for worse, because all of us are, most of us are lifers, and what that looks like changes for every single person. But like, a person who's like fandom that I really admire is like Fenris from Darkthrone. Like that dude still listens to underground heavy metal. He's clearly still cares about it so much that he actually is listening to new bands and like suggesting them, recommending them. And I really like that, because like, I feel like, obviously I'm not Fenris, but I feel like I occupy like a similar space and like do a similar thing that he does, which is like, I want to hear the newest, freshest underground, weirdest, ugliest, strangest thing, and that's what excites me, like not album number 35 by Iron Maiden, even though I love Iron Maiden, but I don't want to listen to Book of Souls.
No, that's like absolutely valid. And Fenris is somebody who like without like, because I don't like to do hero worshipping, but like in terms of like metal, it's just like he occupies that space, as you were saying, that it's just like, not only has he kind of like dedicated his whole life to this and has like really got his pulse on the underground, and he listens to like Radio Fenris and stuff like that. Yeah. Just even seeing the evolution of Darkthrone as a band.
It's cool.
Doing like this weird, like blackened classic heavy metal with like progressive elements now. And it's like, I'm like, they're one of the few bands that like, I know you're saying like about like these like dinosaur bands that are on like album 30. Darkthrone's maybe one of the only older bands that I'm like, I will still buy every release of, because it's like, I know that it's going to be something interesting. Like my pets are even named Ted and Fenris. I've got 2 babies named after them, because anyway, we'll be here for hours if we get talking about Darkthrone.
Yeah. I mean, that's a question of like, obviously I'm sure that there's tons of artists who are like, oh, I like occupying the space that I've been in for whatever amount of time, and it's not like that invalidates their art. It just is not what excites me as a consumer of art and as an artist myself. So
of course, like I think like that's going forward, like kind of an attitude that I think you have to kind of have, because we were discussing earlier about like that making yourself kind of experience new music and stuff that does become more difficult as you age, and it's kind of pushing yourself to do that is difficult.
Yeah.
So like that actually like leads on like really well to a question I had in here. Like, so I get a lot of my new music recommendations from your Instagram.
Woo! That's the whole point.
So how do you manage to keep your finger on the pulse of the underground as well as you manage to? As somebody like, I host a 3-hour metal radio show every week, and sometimes like it's a struggle to find like new things to be excited about and want to show people, and you don't seem to ever struggle with that.
Well, I mean, so I work for Bandcamp. So I basically spend all day every single day on the site, and when you spend all day every single day on the site, it's really easy to press play on every single thing that you hear, and that's it. Like I love hearing new bands, I love hearing new things, and of course there's things that I play over and over and over and over and over like everybody else, but yeah, like I do feel really excited by music discovery, and I find that like if there's a new band that shows up in my Facebook feed, for example, I save that post. If there's album cover that I see on Instagram that looks interesting, I immediately go to that page. So it's just a part of, it's like such a intrinsic part of like what I've been doing for the last 15 years, because before I worked at Bandcamp, I worked for a record label full-time in Toronto. And before that, I ran a record pressing plant in Alberta. And before that, I ran a music magazine in Alberta. So, you know, I've like pretty much worked every single music industry job you could possibly have. And not only that, but every job that I've been at, it's been like the struggle to be acknowledged as like the one who wants to help the underground, you know, because even back when I started as a journalist, you know, a lot of what I was doing was like, okay, I want to make sure that the local scene gets represented. And then it was, how do I represent the Canadian scene? And then it was, how do I represent the Toronto scene? How do I represent the metal scene or the punk scene or the rap scene or whatever? And yeah, it's just, I don't know, it's just become so entrenched in my daily routine. I can't imagine really doing anything else.
It's impressive regardless, because like the kind of wealth of new band recommendations, and like, yeah, I can kind of like, it's almost like a very like very respected seal of approval if you've recommended a band. And it's very rare that I disagree with like a recommendation that you make. So it's kind of, yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, so like I've like, it's just kind of like rounding out the interview now. One thing I would like to ask is like, how did the your involvement with Banger TV come about? Because I think like a lot of people may like know you as well for, you know, your sort of like reviews on Banger TV as they do for your like musical career and whatnot.
Yeah, they, back when they started Banger TV, I got an email. Before I moved to Toronto, actually, I had emailed them and been like, are you guys looking for any full-time staff? I want to work for your company. And I never heard back. And I was like, okay, whatever, that's fine. And then I moved to Toronto and I started working full-time doing like A&R and like social media and stuff for a record label in Toronto. And I eventually got this email from a woman who is now like a very good friend to this day, Lisa Latisseur. And she said, hey, Sarah, you came really highly recommended. And that was through my music academia stuff, actually, that I came recommended, because our friend Natalie Zena Walshots actually recommended me for the job. She was at the time like a metal journalist, and now she's actually a published author who's been doing quite well and has her first book out, and it actually did exceptionally well, which is very exciting. But she recommended me for the role, and so they asked me to come in and to audition. And the very first album that I reviewed was the Demal album, The Lesser God. And they were so impressed with my audition that they published it on the site. And then from there, it just kept going.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, like your well, like Banger in general is just like a fantastic resource for like metal, and it's kind of like, it's very much an inspiration of what we're kind of trying to do with the online magazine that we're getting started. And yeah.
That's cool. Yeah, thank you. It's I don't do as much with them anymore. Like I'm still doing reviews like occasionally, but it's hard when you're in Finland and making albums and just spending time doing nothing.
It sounds like a really nice life.
It's very nice. I enjoy growing older.
As a kind of like final thing, we asked you to pick 5 songs to play on the radio show, you know, to kind of like give people a taste of like Smoulder and you as an artist.
Yeah.
I just wondered if you'd be okay. We'll go through them track by track, and just kind of like maybe if you go through why they were something that you picked.
Sure. I'm just gonna go back to the email.
I have them written down if that's useful.
Oh, okay. That's totally helpful. Yeah.
So the first one was The Axeman by Omen.
Yeah. Yeah, I love Omen. I especially love that album, Battle Cry. It's like a US power metal classic. Definitely hugely influential to Smoulder because like it's classic heavy metal, but it's like in that realm of fantasy where you're the axe wielding hero, you know? And I really identify with that, especially as a person who grew up loving sword and sorcery books and sword and sorcery films. you know, like, and not only that, but every single song on that album is a certified banger. And I think that that is something that more bands should aspire to do, which is like all killer, no filler. If an album or if a song in your album is not as good as the single, then you should take it out. And that's what Omen did. Every song on that album is a fucking banger.
Like, absolutely. Like, this, it's kind of like a really, it's like a very pervasive thing, especially with those like legacy bands where like, yeah, they will put out very, very bloated albums. Like,
Yeah.
you know, like you mentioned Book of Souls before, and I think like the most recent like Halloween album's like a really good example of that as well, where there were like some,
It's a good record, but it's like 22 minutes too long.
yeah,
You know,
100%.
like it would have been great if they had just taken a step back and been like, let's fit this on a single LP, because almost every single, and I mean, that's also a format wars situation, because like when CDs became the ubiquitous format instead of vinyl, when CDs first were popularized, the length of them was generally 60 minutes.
Mhm.
And so bands started normalizing their albums being 60 minutes. I'm like, just because you can do 60 minutes doesn't mean you should.
Yeah.
Raining Blood is perfect, and it's like 32 and a half minutes. Like, just cut that shit off there.
Like, absolutely. And I think there's probably, it's like that kind of like thing of like necessity being the mother of invention, blah, blah, blah. So probably having that limiting factor of like, you know, the 44 minutes for a vinyl, it forces a band to self-edit, and that's not a bad thing.
Yes.
And I say this as somebody that
very
loves,
good thing.
I say this as somebody that loves bands like Rush and things like that do like the long, you know, like long form, very self-indulgent kind of tracks and stuff like that. But yeah.
Yeah.
So the next one was There Will Be Justice by Chastain.
Oh yeah, I love Chastain. I love Leather Leone. She has such a powerful voice, and she was such an interesting character like within heavy metal history, because there's lots of interviews with her where basically Chastain like didn't get big because she refused to play like by the industry rules, and the industry was basically telling her at the time like, we need you to be sexier, we need you to be like show more skin, do more things. And she was like, fuck that, I'm not doing it. And instead she just sang with so much gusto. And I mean, David Chastain, fantastic guitarist, like they were such a powerhouse duo, and it's too bad that they refused to like do shows together. Because oh god, I really love her voice, which she's like the female Ronnie James Dio, you know, like she's got that, like she's got the grit and the power and the determination and like the self, she's so self-possessed. And yeah, I just really loved what Chastain did, not just with that album, but with like multiple of their early albums. Oh, they're so powerful and just gritty and like kick you in the face. That's great.
I mean, like, until you made that recommendation, I hadn't, like, I'd slept on them and hadn't listened to them, and I regret that. Like after having listened to the album. The next one is Solitude Ambius by The Destiny Falls to Ruin.
Oh yeah, so that song is fantastic. Solitude Eternus is a American epic doom metal band, and that band and that album, it was actually one of the albums that like Vincent and I like first truly bonded over, and hilariously enough, right before we started dating, he found me a copy of like Into the Depths of Sorrow, which is the album that song is on. And it was like the legendary copy that had like a handwritten promo letter from the guitarist John Perez. And I had already had it on cassette for years, and I had actually bought it from Rob from Witch Mountain. And it was one of those cassettes that I actually had worn out in my truck. But yeah, it's essentially like this really sad, really downtrodden epic doom with these huge wailing vocals. Oh, it sounds so good.
No, like again, like all 5 of these songs are just like slap. So Fate's Warning, sorry, I can't read my own writing.
Fata Morgana.
Thank you. We even got a performance on the podcast.
Yeah, it's because you can't, like, if you haven't, so Fate's Warning is hilarious because they're one of those bands that like one of my best friends introduced me to, I don't know, probably 12 years ago. one of those bands, when I first heard them, I was like, this is some real dork shit. I don't like it. And it took me years of over and over and over being like, why do I not like Fate's Warning? Like, why? I know I should. Everyone whose bands I like likes Fate's Warning. So I just kept going back and back to it. And then finally it was like exactly what you said about Talisman and the Blade. Like, why do I hate this? Oh God, I think I love this. And that's kind of where I've landed with Fate's Warning. Is just the vocals of John Arch are so unusual. Like, he has such interesting pacing and such interesting timing. And not only that, but I think there's a lot to be said about heavy metal that has soul. And I think that Fate's Warning is the perfect example of a band that is not technically perfect, but there's so much love and so much gusto put into the performance that it just elevates it to another level. And I think that it's really easy, especially now, for heavy metal musicians to be like, oh, well, if I play perfectly and if I'm on note for note, then it makes it good. But I'm like, I would rather have the warts and the love than the perfection, you know?
Yeah, it absolutely. It goes back to what you're saying about like the producer forcing you to be auto-tuned. It's like you need that kind of like imperfection to make something with character. Like,
yeah, I mean, ugly is where heavy metal thrives.
yeah, absolutely.
So
and the final track that you picked is from one of my absolute all-time favorite bands, Blind Guardian. Follow the Blind.
Yeah, and I specifically chose Follow the Blind because there's a new song, or there's a song on the new album called Spellforger, and I think that it's like very Blind Guardian influenced, even if Vincent doesn't agree with me. I don't care. But Spellforger was like this song that Kevin and I wrote, and it's basically just like 3 minutes of like just very anthemic, constant singing, really going for it. And I feel like Blind Guardian, like, I think Hansi Kirsch is probably one of the best living vocalists, first of all.
I can't agree more.
Yeah, like, he's just such a powerful vocalist. He has so much like strength and so much gusto. And
it's like the sense of like drama that he can bring to it as well. Like, like he can be so soft, but then like also like, yeah, sorry, I
no, it's totally accurate. I mean, like, part of the reason why I think Blind Guardian has endured so long is because they are really great at making songs that are sing-alongs. And like, that's something that I want to do more with Smoulder. Is like, I like what he does when it's like, oh, you know, like stuff like that, where the crowd can get involved and they can sing too. And it's still like, it's not just self-serving. It like actually, you know, propels the momentum of the song. And I feel like Follow the Blind is just like one of those songs where, like, you know, when you hear it, it's just, you have to sing along. And I love that. And like, that's what I wanted to do with Spellforger. And I think I did. I'm very curious to see how it goes off live when we play it on our tour in September.
I can't wait to hear it.
So yeah.
So but yeah, it's like that moment in it's like from the live tour from like when they did Imaginations from the Other Side. Like there was like a live DVD that they put out, and it's like when they did Valhalla, they literally could not end the song because the crowd was singing, and you can see Hansi like going to speak into the microphone, but the crowd is just so loud and continuing to sing the chorus to Valhalla that the band would just shrug and then start playing the chorus again.
I mean, imagine having that kind of, I don't want to say power over people, but it is like, your art has so much power over people that people are literally like screaming along and like lost in like the ecstasy of it. And like, that to me is like quintessential heavy metal, not the fake like inverted cross goat moon fucking like bullshit posturing. It's like when we all come together and everybody is so pumped on a song that everybody is like singing along or moshing or crying or hugging or doing whatever. Like, those songs to me are going to be the ones that really endure throughout heavy metal history. And obviously, like, I want to make a song that feels like that, you know, like, and I think, you know, so far it seems like we got a couple people are singing along. We're going to festivals and there's 1,000 people singing along, and I'm like, okay, like, this is the beginning. Maybe we'll see, but like, that feels good.
Yeah, it's that level of sincerity in metal, and that the lack of fear to be ridiculous and so sincere is kind of what I love about metal. And I think that's kind of like a really nice like tone to kind of like end on.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and just like sort of finally, if obviously you have the new album coming out, etc. If there's you want to like plug that and kind of let people know where and when they can pick that up and stuff.
Yeah, so Smoulder's second studio album, which is called Violent Creed of Vengeance, will be released on April 21st via Cruz del Sur Records. We will be playing the Wednesday, April 19th, the warm-up party for Keep It True in Germany to celebrate. And we're also going to be playing at a festival in France called Chaos Descends. Oh, shit. Did I mix that up? I'm so sorry.
No, it's cool.
So many things coming up. Sean, what's the festival in France? Courts of Chaos. We're playing Courts of Chaos in France in May as well. And yeah, you can buy the album or pre-order the album now from smoulder.bandcamp.com. You can also get it from the Cruz del Sur Records web store. And yeah, hopefully we'll be playing a city near you soon.
Any plans to come to the UK?
Oh, Brexit's made that so hard. Yeah. We're trying our best. Like, we have a booking agency, which is great. But we've had a lot of people be like, why don't you tour more? And I'm like, well, there's 3 years right now of COVID related backlogs. There's inflation, and there's the fact that like everybody's trying to get out there. So be patient.
Well,
it's like
it'll be worth
the
wait.
Very like Wayne's World phrase, like if you book them, they will come.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't vote for Brexit, and I think like, the fact that we are the only country that has ever voluntarily imposed trade sanctions on ourselves is just insanity. But
well, it's not just the UK that's become more difficult for artists, it's also the US, because the US just proposed changes to the vising or the touring musician visas, and they want to make it so they're $1,500 per person now.
Jesus.
So it's just going to make it like, basically, yeah, that's a whole other conversation about this worldwide swing into the right-wing totalitarian bullshit where people are like, if we shut down the borders, the economy will improve. It's like, it won't. It's not going to. Like, the cost of everything is very bad, and shutting down borders is just going to make everything more miserable for everybody.
Yeah, it's almost like we live in a massively interconnected world with complex supply lines.
Yeah,
and
almost.
Isolationism is not the conducive with. Sorry.
The success of it, yeah, it's very frustrating, this whole situation. But like the way that we can work through it and work past it is voting and creating community and supporting our communities. So that's what we got to keep doing.
Yeah, hard agree. Thank you so much for joining. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it. And when this goes live, can you send me a link?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Okay, and I assume you're going to edit out some of this.
Like maybe like the little bit at the beginning, but we generally tend to just put it out as like as is, like clip the beginning and end if there's like kind of things, but it generally goes out kind of like unedited because we like the kind of freeform conversation.
Yeah,
I don't think we said anything controversial.
No, I mean, nothing controversial to. No, maybe I'm not going to say that. Nothing controversial here.
It's an absolute pleasure, Sarah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we'll maybe talk at another time.
Yeah, I'd love that. Anyway, take care.
All right, bye.
Bye.